What we're going to do very shortly is we're going to create a shopping centre, effectively. And in this shopping centre there are going to be 3 shops. Okay? This will sound wacky when I explain it initially, but you'll be glad you went along with me. So in each shop there are certain things that are for sale or you can buy. The first shop is called Community Land. Okay? And that's going to be one of these up here, all right? And Community Land has a slogan. Community Land is the place where everybody knows your name and they're always glad you came. And you all have a tune in your head now, don't you? The other shop in this shopping centre is called Service Land. And their slogan is where everybody is treated just the same. Some people call it equality. And the third shop is Co-Production Land. Very jargony term. A bit swanky, new kid on the block, only around a few years, but you know, is finding its market. And co-production has a slogan, and the slogan is where we do together what we can't do alone. Catchy. I think it could catch on. So eventually we're going on a shopping trip, all 200 of us, and we're going to figure out which shop most people would go to. Because that's going to give us some really interesting evidence around where we need to base our future plans. So I suppose the question that we're going to dig into is where do most people think their good life is determined? Is it in co-production? Is it in community, or is it in service land? If you look at the flow of capital at the moment, you look at where most folk are investing time, energy and money, you would be forgiven for assuming that a good life is found in the marketplace. A good life is in service land. Not just in a corporate sense, in the sense of, you know, private market, but in the sense of public sector and third sector too. So we're going to test whether or not you folk believe that's the case. So we're going to do an exercise that really challenges and draws that out. And we'll see where it takes us. To do this, to figure out where you personally think a good life is determined, or where you'd find a good life, we're going to ask you in a moment to work again in groups of 3. So again, working with some people you haven't worked with before, because today is so much about networking and making new connections. In those groups of 3, what I would like you to do is this. I'd like you to have a genuine, honest-to-God conversation with each other about what needs to happen for you to have a good life. And to really spice the conversation up a bit, I want you to imagine yourself into a situation where you're 85 years of age, okay? Or older if you are 85. Okay? And I want you to imagine that you have some kind of a medical label. Something that the world puts on you and says, you've got a set of needs. Right? Make it up. Whatever it might be. Whatever makes sense to you. But you're the kind of person who wants to live at home in your community. So despite the fact that you have some kind of label, you're 85 plus, you're still determined, this is where I stand, this is my community. Okay, so that's the context. That's how I want you to imagine the exercise. Once you've done that in your groups of 3, what I'd like you to do is take your post-it notes there. You'll see every table has post-it notes. And I want you to identify 6 things that you would not be prepared to give up that would determine a good life for you. It might be your ability to go salsa dancing. I don't know what it might be. It could be anything. But 6 things that really matter to you and would matter to you at that age, despite the label. Does that make sense? And what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to take those 6 things. So in a group of 3 you would have 18 things that you'd identify. Take each one and put it very clearly on a post-it. So salsa dancing, for example, would go on one post-it. And so on. And I really want you to try and do this in a very personal way. Really think about it. Once we have our post-its, then we're going to go shopping. I'm going to give you all a personal budget. I've got an authority from Trafford Council to give you all unlimited personal budgets. So you can buy what you like. There's no restriction, okay? But for now, and I'll talk you through every step along the way, this is going to be absolutely fascinating. You have to trust me as we go through the process. For now, the first step is if you stand up again and find yourself 2 people you don't know in the room and form into groups of 3. Said to me during the coffee break that they found it really interesting that it was easier in the Great Escape exercise to identify the gifts of the other person than it was to identify their own personal gifts. And that happens a huge amount. So please do help each other. Ask the questions that are going to be supportive of the conversation. What's going to happen here, can't you? you've got these things that you want to have a good life, that you're prepared to fight for, and probably would expect your family and community to fight for on your behalf, or at least with you. And what I'm going to ask you to do with your personal budget, which is very generous, is to decide yourself. You self-determine where you think you're going to get this thing that matters to you. And I just want to take you through the options very clearly. So one is service land. And just so you know what are on the shelves of service land, what they stock is programs run by professionals of a very high standard, with very, very clear evidence, and, you know, quite a lot of evaluation frameworks behind them. So they can guarantee a certain standard. I flew over this morning with Aer Lingus, and there's something really reassuring about, as a passenger anyway, about being on a plane where you're treated the same as everybody else, unless you bumped up to first class, in which case I'm very happy to be treated differently, but it never happens. But you can imagine being on an airplane and the pilot coming over the airwaves and saying, "Good morning, I am a trained community development worker and I think we should run a democratic airline, so why don't you talk to the person beside you and ask them what button I should press?" That would be scary. Or walking through your community, you kind of get an angina pain and a really helpful neighbour says, "You know, we're really neighbourly around here, so listen, don't worry," and they kind of put you up on their kitchen table and take a knife out of the drawer, and you kind of go, that's not the way the world's supposed to work. So service land is very much about providing services and providing programs, and it's an important tool for change. Community land is not about services, really. It's about mutuality, it's about friendship, it's about support, it's about creativity, breaking the rules sometimes. I should say some of the most interesting stuff I've ever seen is where folk in service land, what I call disruptive innovators. I've actually grown to believe there's no point in trying to change systems. I'm much more interested in creating disruptive innovation. If I'm waiting until the system changes, I'll probably be waiting until I die. But if what I want to do is disrupt and create some innovation within the disruption, then I can do it tomorrow. So this is about being a Trojan mouse rather than a Trojan horse. And one of the most interesting examples I've ever come across in terms of disruptive innovation comes from a guy by the name of Jerome Miller, still alive but retired now. And Jerome in the 80s was employed in Massachusetts to shut down, essentially, juvenile homes, penitentiaries, that kind of thing. So places of incarceration for young people. And he came to the conclusion, after spending many years thinking about his brief, that the very best he could do for young people was the worst thing that could happen to young people. That the solutions he had in service land were not going to reduce recidivism, were not going to ensure that person had a good life. So one of the things he did, and I really admire him for doing this, is he went to university students and he said, this was in the 80s, every year we spend about $70,000 on each of these young people, and we fail them every single year. What I'm prepared to do is, if you and the young person can actually figure out a way that young person can have a good life and actually learn about being a good citizen together, I'm not going to give you 70,000, but I'm going to give you a portion of that. And this was around the time that Pan Am were offering these around-the-world trips. Do you remember these? So essentially, start in New York or wherever, and you could go around the world in a matter of, I guess, a couple of years. You could have 4 stops, or 20 stops, or 50 stops. So one particular young person came back to Jerome and said, "Jerry, I have a brilliant idea. Give us $6,000, I think it was $6,000 for the ticket. Right? We will disappear for a year and give us some spending money. We won't stay in any fancy hotel, but give us some spending money and, you know, away we'll go. Kim won't be in a penitentiary, we'll have some interesting experiences, and I'll vouch for their well-being." And Jerry did it. He was one of the most either brilliant or reckless public administrative officials I've ever come across. He did it. He did it en masse. He said to communities, come up with ideas that can do for these kids what we can't do in the system, and we'll support you. He put his job on the line every single time he made the decision. And every single time, without exception, for over a decade, it worked out. Kids stopped offending. Things got better. And students did well out of it too. So that's what I mean by the relationship sometimes between service land and community land. They can do stuff together. And that's the world of co-production, where somehow we find a way of working together to do stuff that the system can't do on its own, or that the community simply can't do through mutuality and support. So that's what I mean by the 3 shops. That's what's on their shelf. Is that clear? Is that helpful? So now what I'd like you to do is think about your 6 things. And I'd like you to come up here carefully, okay, and put each one where you think you're going to get best return. Okay? So have a think about that. And when you're ready, come on and post up here in the new shop that we've created.
Look how that panorama one came out. That's really good. I use that one, I think.
You like that? Yeah. I'm glad you thought of that, because I think I was too
Well, I don't want to sound disrespectful, but with your height, I don't think you can get above everyone. Do you know what I mean? I'm really sorry, Rowena, to say that, but do you know what I mean?
No, it was really good.
Look, if you stand on there, you can see everything.
No, you did a good job. Yeah. No, it's beautiful. It's really. Yeah, I know. Well, that's
Can you crop that?
Yeah, you can crop that. Yeah. Beautiful. Yes, yeah, I know.
To get my wife to buy one for my birthday.
Yeah, well, that's what we need to capture.
Yeah.
Guys, can you switch me on? is to recognize that actually, for most people, if in fact for everybody, it's not. There's a portion of it, a very important, essential portion of it, and it probably costs an awful lot more to resource. I understand that. But it's very, very hard to make an economic argument that 80% of the resources should go into resourcing 20% of the contribution. So I think this is really radical thinking, because what it's inviting us to think through is not alone how do we provide services, but also how do we build community. And I think what's powerful about this, because I do this exercise a lot lately around the UK, is it's nearly always the same. Sometimes there's more here and less here, but in terms of the divide, people predominantly take the view that my good life is found in my community. The challenge is we don't live in communities. We live in neighbourhoods often that are really struggling to connect. And that's becoming truer and truer. There's so many things that exist in neighbourhoods that are fantastic, but it's becoming harder and harder for people in neighbourhoods to connect and do what they're passionate about. And that's what I want to talk about in this next 20 minutes or so, is how we can organise ourselves in such a way that all of this stuff that people really care about can get identified, discovered if you like, and connected up. So what I'm going to have to do, I think, is move the community domain over here a little bit so you can see the slides. And let me just talk a little bit about how not alone we can really ensure that we have a life of our choosing, which is broadly, as we've said already, about community, but also how we can figure out a way to ensure that serviceland, people in services, professional people, can use their supportive functions to support community and co-production. You see, inside every single organisation are people, not programs or services, people. And it's people who make a difference to other people. All of us have strengths. And yet, a lot of evidence shows now that we don't just focus on deficits in communities. We are also very deficit-based in our organisations. And that isn't just in the public sector or the third sector. That's in faith communities. That's often even in residents' associations. Because we live in a culture that's competitive, that actually says, for me to win, you must lose. And I think what's powerful about an asset-based way of thinking is it invites people to be cooperative. So the powerful message isn't use your assets. That's besides the point. The powerful message is connect. And the best way to connect is by focusing on what you have. Because that will prevent you from entering into competitive behaviour. It will promote cooperation. So the focus is almost misnamed, this asset-based community development. It should be connection-based community development. That's what I want to share some thoughts on with you during these 20 minutes or so. What is asset-based community development, and how is it different? How is it unique? And what use might it have for us? So, very simple terms, obviously, it's a perspective. So one of the things that is really important to get across is ABCD is not a model, and it's not a product. It is a perspective, it's an approach, and it's a lifestyle choice. That's why so many people, when they hear about it, say, I've been doing that for years, I just didn't have language, I didn't know, how to describe it. I have been hearing over the last couple of hours lots and lots of examples of people doing asset-based community development, from policing, to housing, to health, to local community folk, just using the resources they have to make a difference. What I want to do over these next 20 minutes is give you a kind of a framework that confirms and affirms what you're doing, but also maybe highlights some possibilities for additional connection. Just a little bit of background for a second, if I may. Asset-based community development as a perspective and as an approach was developed by the two guys you see behind me here. John McKnight is the chap with the beard, and Jody Pressman, his partner in crime, along with 18 other people in the late 80s, became really concerned around the fact that most so-called low-income communities were being defined as backwaters of pathology. They were being defined as the sum of their problems. And most professionals who were trying to be helpful were trying to be helpful on the basis of attempting to fix those problems. So they were doing onto communities rather than doing with communities. The focus was predominantly the half-empty part of the glass. Now, what John and Jody knew, even though they were professors at Northwestern University by time in the late 80s, they decided to do something about this. What they knew on the basis that they were all, throughout their lives, working in neighborhoods. They were community builders who worked in neighborhoods. And what they knew is that in every neighborhood they worked in for over 40 years, people were using the little bit of what they had, connecting it together to make change happen. So they knew that people had the capacity to produce their own health, produce their own education, produce their own wisdom, and that in fact, what was happening was, folk who were trying to be helpful were causing people to be non-productive without intending. So they spent 4 years in the late 80s traveling into 300 neighborhoods that had been defined by the half-empty part of the glass, and asking people in those neighborhoods to tell them stories about a time that they came together to make things better. It's really important to say that there are two ways of knowing in this world. One is through studies, the other is through stories. Studies lead to more data. Stories create a movement for change. People are not standing with placards saying, we want change as soon as we have an evidence peer review. People are actually mobilized for change because somehow new stories with new possibilities emerge. Stories about people just like them, who are using a little bit of what they have to create change and make things happen. Today we're having a lunch in the Martin Luther room, is that right? That's really interesting. Because if you think of the Martin Luther story, what you might be forgiven for doing is assuming that all change emerged in terms of civil rights from that podium that day in 1963 when Martin Luther King said, I have a dream today. Words he didn't even write. But actually the change emerged decades beforehand, with ordinary people in neighborhoods all over the state, sometimes working 2 and 3 jobs in crowded conditions, dealing with huge challenges, organizing, trying to build what they could in their community to make change happen. They're the people who marched from all over the states. And they're the people who formed 250,000 people at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in freedom's name. That's where the change resides. Not on the I Have a Dream podium. But culturally, we love heroes. We love the idea of the great white knight riding over the hill to save the day. But the truth of the matter is, there ain't no white knight coming. There never was. We are the people we've been waiting for, if we can be the change we seek. So what John and Jody discovered in every one of those 300 communities, and we're still discovering it today, there are people intentionally working through an asset-based approach that are in neighborhoods right now, in this vicinity, discovering the exact same thing. That actually what makes change happen in people's lives are 6 building blocks, and they recur in different ways everywhere we go. So we have, since the late 80s, as a faculty of which I'm part, we've been really inspired, actually is the word, by the extent to which, no matter where you go, no matter what the culture, no matter what the challenge, how these 6 assets recur, or these building blocks. So let me share with you what the 6 building blocks of a healthy, sustainable, vibrant and prosperous community are. The first is local residents. People. People actually define themselves not by what they receive, but by their passions. Communities are like football matches, aren't they? Where you've got 22 people who least need the exercise doing all the work, and 3,000 people who most need the exercise telling them what to do. But you're not going to change communities by getting those 3,000 people to play football. Everybody cares about something enough to get up off their couch and do something about it. But we've organised the world in such a way that we're not asking people what they care about enough to act upon. We're asking people to care about what we care about. And when they don't, we call them apathetic. But everybody cares about something enough to act upon it. It may just not be what we want them to care about. So they may not care about health, or active aging, or obesity. But in some shape or other, they care about something. And if you could start there and work from there, maybe in time, they care about those things too. So starting with this view that every resident, regardless of labels, because what labels do is they obscure the gifts within people. What assets do is they reveal them. So most of our gifts in neighbourhoods, particularly if our neighbourhoods have been defined as low-income, problematic neighbourhoods, most of our gifts are invisible because they don't show up on a radar. They don't appear in our funding applications, but they're there. They're absolutely there, and they're there in abundance. The way to reveal them is to find people who know about their giftedness. In 1940, in Chicago, women had forgotten how to breastfeed. Can you believe that? It was a major public health crisis. But nobody noticed it. Because the formula industry said, if you really care about your children, you won't breastfeed them. You give them formula milk, it's much better. We had evidence. And 5 women, led by Marion Thompson, said, you know what? You know what you can do with your evidence? We're feeding our children, using our reserve. The most fundamental asset you have as a woman, as a mother. And what's really interesting is that group of 5 women have grown over the period of whatever it is now, some 50 years or so. They've grown to be in 87 different countries around the world. You know what the movement is called? The Leche. And what was interesting is they had to call it the Leche League because you couldn't say breast in public in Chicago in the 1940s. These are just stories, they're just examples, but what they illustrate is the power of individuals when they define themselves by what they contribute rather than what they receive. In other words, when people define themselves as citizens in a democracy rather than ratepayers and clients in service land. Now, we're a bit of both a lot of the time, but fundamentally, where change happens, where communities get stronger, we have a critical mass of people who are defining themselves, local people, who are defining themselves by their gifts and talents, and defining each other in the same terms. The second building block is really, really important. It's the building block of associational life. And what I mean by associational life is where 3 or more people come together, not because they're paid, but based on a passion or an interest or a concern that they have, a dream maybe that they have, and do something about that. So those informal social networks are critical. 80% of civil society in the UK is made up of those informal groups. They will never ever apply to the big lottery. They are invisible to most of our radars. They don't appear on third sector radars, they certainly don't appear on public sector radars. Because they're sort of busy getting on with their lives. They don't even have a name, a lot of them. Poker clubs, so I'm part of a poker club, so I always use it as an example. We don't have a name. So even if it meant that we, for whatever reason decided that we wanted to make an application, which I don't think we'd ever want to, we'd have to do all sorts of things that actually would make us something other than a poker club. And this is a really big challenge. Associational life matters hugely. That space where people are unpaid, they're just coming together by consent and by passion, is dying on its feet in an awful lot of European countries. And what's really interesting and challenging, I think, is that the reason it's dying is because we have been trying to be helpful in service land for so long. That people have come to believe that they are incompetent as associations. That our associations can't make change happen in the same way and to the same extent that professional, qualified, credentialed people can. It's interesting. One of the movements, the associational movements I'm most inspired by is the men's shed movement in Australia. Many people have heard about men's sheds. Fantastic. So the men's shed movement, lots of people have talked about this, you've probably heard about this already, but the men's shed movement, simply blokes who decided spontaneously across Australia, in neighbourhoods, you know, what's the point in living my life lonely in the backyard, you know, using a shed with my tools, fixing stuff in the house, when if me and 4 or 5 other guys living locally pooled all our tools together in a common shed, we could offer to fix things in local communities. We'd have all kinds of new relationships, new connections, and it would be useful. We'd feel useful. So many people are dying in later life, both of a sense of loneliness and a sense of uselessness. And these guys did something about it. They said, we've got all kinds of resources, all kinds of knowledge, let's do something. This became a phenomenon. It actually spread all throughout Australia, which is quite unusual because Australia is a vast continent and it only has 15 million people. So anything spreading across a continent like that is quite remarkable, but it did. And it spread so fast and was so inspiring that researchers decided they had to understand what was going on. Because rumour had it that men who were involved in men's sheds were living longer. Right? So they sent the researchers in. The federal government resourced universities to go in and study this phenomenon, this public health phenomenon. Because of course, men and their health is a real issue for public health. They're hard to reach, isn't that the expression? So here they were, as a standing target in these men's sheds. And the research was powerful. It discovered many different things. One of the things that it discovered is that men will talk about almost anything if they've got Part2 in their hand. The other thing that they discovered was the rumour was right. Absolutely. Men were living longer because they were more connected. Fantastic. Great stuff. And when I was in Australia and visited the men's sheds, you couldn't but see that that was the case. There's lots of people in the UK tell the story secondhand. There's nothing like actually going and being there. So I've been there and I've seen the evidence. But what did the federal government then do? The federal government then started offering funding to men's sheds. So over a 10 to 20 year period, this movement grew naturally. And within a year of federal government funding, guess what happened? It stopped dead and then started to decrease. So actually, funding can be a massive, massive problem in associational life. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't resource, it doesn't mean that we can't support, but it's really important to recognize the challenge. So associational life doesn't grow in the same way that institutional life grows. And I think that's one of the things to consider when you're thinking about a partnership. Yeah, how do you form a partnership that isn't just about thinking about how institutions can better surround people who are vulnerable? But how do you form a partnership that can think about liberating the strengths and the capacities of individuals and their associations? That's the primary question. That's the untapped treasure trove. And if we can do that as well as providing services at a point of need, then we will actually start to see real change. But to do that, we need to think about the third building block that all of the stories are telling us. What people are saying is that the institutions that are most useful to them when it comes to building community, when it comes to liberating the power of individuals and their associations, are institutions that act like treasure chests instead of fortress walls. They don't expect people to, crawl through the hoops, as it were. In other words, they've figured out how they can organize their systems the way people organize their lives. And one of the most, for me, inspiring institutions I mentioned earlier on is Seattle local government. So for 20-odd years, they reorganized city government the way people organize their lives. And instead of having everything centralized or even localized, they went right to the heart of where people live their lives, in neighborhoods. They created little mini halls where people could pretty much do any government business they needed to do. But more importantly, they resourced each of those neighborhoods with community builders who knew how to support the community, to weave itself together. These were not outside agencies coming in. These were local people who were resourced by City Council to do the community building and to find connectors. In the afternoon, I'll be talking to you about the process of community building. But for me, it's a really, really interesting test site, Seattle. Problem is, recently a new mayor has come into post. And the new mayor, like any mayor in American politics, American giveth and American taketh away. The new mayor has decided that this neighbourhood lark is rubbish. This idea of actually handing power to the people is a nonsense. Nice to do in times when you've got lots of money and lots of resource, but it's beside the point when you don't. Because his view is, his responsibility is to ensure statutory, mandatory services are provided to the people with greatest levels of need. And he feels that's core business. And anything that isn't core business is a distraction and a luxury. So effectively, he's shutting down all of the little mini halls and he's taking community building away. I believe, but I would, he'll live to rue that day. But it's really, really interesting to recognise that these are the kinds of decisions that we're currently making, on a knife edge often. But what was fascinating about those 20 years is that Seattle City Council figured out how to fly on both wings. They were able to provide the services that are so important, but also they were able to do something that local governments were set up to do. They were able to become stewards of democracy that place citizens at the centre rather than bureaucracy at the centre. So organisations that have the capacity to organise themselves the way people organise their lives, they're the organisations that make a difference, and they're the assets to community building. The ones that don't tend to get in the way. So often the advice that we give organisations is the first thing you can do to be helpful is get out of the way. This associational life doesn't need you to come in and fix it. It just needs you to leave it be. And maybe at most how you can be helpful is to give some resource around helping those associations to connect. The other building blocks that are really important to mention are physical and economic resources. We can't meaningfully think about health or community development without also talking seriously about economic development and exchange, not just of money, but exchange of gifts and exchange of time. So time banking is one of the really powerful movements in the UK. I think they now have 28,000 people at local level figuring out how they can use mutuality to exchange with each other to ensure people have a good life. And the final building block that recurs in every story that people tell us about having a good life at neighbourhood level is the building block of stories. That stories are what fundamentally support people to make change happen. And I suppose in a sense what we're finding all over the UK now, we being Nurture Development, which is the organisation that I work with, in West Croydon, in Thurrock, in Torbay, Gloucestershire and Derby, Kirklees and Leeds and starting in Scotland, is that when you intentionally focus on people's strengths and their assets and you support them to connect together around those assets and strengths, things change. In Croydon, over the last 4 years, Croydon was in fact the first place in the UK to intentionally do community building. Paul Macy was the first community builder. And over the period of 4 years, what we've seen emerge across 4 wards and numerous neighbourhoods are nearly 100 new associations made up of local people taking action on the things they care about. 2 weeks ago, in Croydon Council, an agreement was reached to work towards ensuring that there would be a community builder in every ward. 4 years takes time. This is messy stuff. It's complicated stuff. But what the elected members of the executive saw was that change was happening from inside out. Change was happening in a way that they hadn't seen before. It was being led primarily by people. And that change wasn't just the kind of change that sees, a green walk to school or a community lunch. It was seeing that, and it was also seeing people flex massive civic muscle and show power. Start defining what a good life would need to look like 20 years from now. Start taking on some really serious challenges around the fact that there's hate crime in our local neighbourhood. What are we going to do about the fact that an awful lot of people over the age of 65 who are well enough to go home can't leave our hospitals because their families can't look after them? And so what we're seeing, not just in Croydon, but all over the UK, and you guys are seeing it in your work here too, is that people's capacities, if they're supported, can do all kinds of things that are truly inspiring and transformative. There's a picture of some of the community builders in Croydon. In Torbay, we're working also to really think about not alone how can we ensure that local neighbourhoods create the connectivity that they need to think about changes for the next 10, 20 years, which will be phenomenal in coastal areas, as they will be in areas like this. But also to think about how we can change systems, how local government can look different, how the NHS can think differently about how it understands the helping role. So one of the things that we're discussing in Torbay is, what would a joint strategic needs assessment look like if it was asset-based? The other thing that we're talking at the moment about is, what would policing look like if it was truly asset-based? And it's quite astounding what people are coming up with. One of the things that people are saying in Torbay and in other parts of the country we're working is, it's impossible to do any kind of analysis of people's needs unless they first know themselves what resources and capacities they have. In the same way that this weekend, you'll probably, most of you, go and do a shop. And before you go and do a shop, you'll make a list of what you think you need. But actually, that list is predicated on what's already in your presence. You'll check to see what you have, then make a list, then go shopping. And anybody who's ever gone shopping, not having checked what they need, do you ever go and do a shop when you have a bit of a hunger on you? Bad idea. That's the way we've been running public sector organisations for the last 20 years. We've been organisations that have been shopping with a sugar plate. We've been thinking that the best way to make change happen is to help people that we call clients to get good service. But actually, all of the evidence is telling us that doesn't give you a good life. You've said it yourselves. What gives us a good life is the extent to which we're connected to our own assets and resources within community. So what determines our health and well-being is our associational life and the assets of our community. The challenge, I think, is we've created an awful lot of our partnerships on the assumption that society has three legs. It's a three-legged stool. So you have the leg of commerce, you have the leg of government, local and central, and you have the leg of civil society, which is largely made up by third sector. I want to finish this presentation by suggesting to you there's a fourth leg, and that's the leg of associational life, where there is no incorporation, where people don't have a CEO, where people are informally organised to do the things they care about. And I think that's the leg where care is produced, where well-being is produced, and where the potential of real change resides. The real revolution in health, and probably in care generally, resides in recognising that care is a freely given gift of the heart, one person to another. You cannot buy it. You cannot sell it. It's not a commodity. It's something that we can only support people to identify, connect, and mobilise. And the tool for that, for liberating that care, is community building. So my call to action today, my invitation to you today, is continue to provide the wonderful services you provide for about 20% of the time. And turn the lion's share of your attention and your passion and your resource and your compassion towards building community to do what it is that only community can. Because in the final analysis, there's three things I know for certain. There's things that only I, my family, and community can do for me to have a good life. That's the first thing I know. The second thing I know is there will be times in my life when, as well as family and community and my own agency, I will need the support of outside agencies and resources. I know that. And the third thing I know is that there are certain things that agencies just need to get on and do. But what I'd like is to live a life where it worked in that sequence, not the other way around. And I guess my challenge is, I think at the moment, we have it the other way around. We are starting to engage with communities on the basis of our agendas, our solutions, and our sense of what's right. Turning that on its head, I believe, is going to create a whole new set of possibilities. So in the final analysis, the revolution begins when people who've been defined as the problem secure the power to redefine the problem. Thank you.
We now have a break for, you might think that it's lunch, but you can only have lunch if you go out. Okay, so there is walking that you can do, there is
steps, which is kind of a classic thing to say, isn't it, this hour of the evening. But I do think it's important, and probably also important to think about who isn't here. I've had some really interesting conversations during the lunch break, which was fantastic. And people are beginning to think about, well, actually, what happens next? What's this calling us to? So much of the afternoon is thinking about that question. What's this actually calling us to? And I think, in a sense, it's going to call different people to different things. For some people, it's going to be a challenge that's around figuring out how you can take what resources you have and put them at the disposal of community in a very different way. And that's important to figure out. For others, it may be at a much more local level, figuring out how you can use your own capacities and resource within your own neighbourhood. Because, I hope that's not me, as well as occupying Wall Street, we've actually got to figure out, I think, how to occupy our street. Yeah, I mean, I'm absolutely convinced, I'm sold on the idea that we need to change systems, for sure. But actually, if we don't also change the way we're living our lives on our streets at the same time, I'm not so convinced that system change alone will do the trick. And I'm certainly less convinced when I read some of the post-it notes that you guys have put up around what you believe a good life needs to look like. So this afternoon is very much about thinking, I think, in a very, very focused way about how we can mobilize hyper-local change so that it proliferates across Trafford. My understanding of what you're trying to figure out really is, you know, this question of localities. How do you actually go from something that's very centralized to something that's really small and intimate and where people can connect? What I'm not so convinced about, if I'm being completely honest, is that the scale is right just yet. I still think there's more cascading down to be done. And I think what the partnerships are really trying to figure out is how you can get to street level. How you can really begin to mobilize people at neighborhood level, at neighbor level. And that's a lot of what the focus this afternoon is going to be about. But you know, I said earlier on, the wisdom's in the room. People in this room have all come from neighborhoods. They know exactly what needs to happen in their own community. And that includes people who are here in a paid capacity. We all come from neighborhoods too. We're all citizens as well. So I want to introduce what's called World Cafe. We've been using an awful lot of different techniques. Appreciative inquiry, World Cafe, open space, asset-based community development. But all of it boils down to having different conversations, really. And we're going to try and have a different conversation in a few moments. But to frame the conversation, I want to tell a story. And it's my favorite story of all time, actually. It's a story about a village that had a crisis and wasn't sure what to do. So the elders of the village gathered around, as often happens at a time of crisis. And they discussed with each other what they thought might be some of the solutions to the village problem. And what they found at the end of the discussion was they actually didn't know the answer. So they decided to invite somebody in from outside. So they invited a wise woman from a neighbouring village to travel and to be with them to advise them. So after a few days' travel, this wise woman appeared in the village, and she sat with the elders, who were all over 65 and greying. And she listened to them describe what they said was a community challenge. And she said, well, the funny thing is, guys, you don't look like the community to me. You look like a section of the community. So if what you're talking about is a community challenge, could I meet the community? Where are they? So So, slightly red-faced, the elders went about gathering the entire community together. Everybody, without exception. And so they all sat, this entire community, under a cedar tree. And the old woman stood in front of them, the wise woman, and she said, you know this, I can see from all of you, you're wise people. So she said, you know, I'm not going to tell you anything you don't already know. Isn't that right? And they all nodded, a bit like some of you are doing right now. Because I think it was Mark Twain who said that an expert is one of two things, either dead or from out of town. So they nodded, and she said, well, that's great, you agree with me. She said, so can I ask you, do you know what it is I'm going to tell you? And that confused them. And they said, no, we wouldn't have asked you to come and guide us if we knew what you were going to tell us. And she said, well, I'm sorry, if you don't know what you know, I can't help you. And she left the village. And it left everybody in crisis. The elders were unsure what to do. So that evening they sat down and they discussed what had happened. And they concluded that what had actually happened was that the ignorant village people, who are very well educated and very wise, unlike the elders, gave the wrong answer to this wise woman. So they sat with the village and they said to the village, you know what? We're going to try and get this woman back a second time. And be warned this time, if she asks you a question, give her the right answer, because we really need to know what she knows. So the wise woman came back a second time. And she stood in front of the entire village and she said, well, you know, I'm not going to tell you anything you don't already know. So can I ask you a question? Do you know what it is I'm going to tell you? And of course, at this point, they'd all been warned. So they all said, yes, with enthusiasm. And she said, well, that's great, then you don't need me. And she left. Now the others were just getting angry. So that night they sat down and they hatched a cunning plan. And they advised all of the community what they were going to do, and the next day they invited this wise woman back for the third time. And she stood in front of the entire village, and true to form, she said, you know, I'm not going to ask you or tell you anything you don't already know. So can I ask you a question? Do you know what it is I'm going to tell you? And one half of the village said yes, exactly at the same time as the other half said no. And she'd never had that experience before, but being wise, she took a couple of moments to compose herself and she said, you know, this is the best of all possible outcomes. Can those who said no, please speak to those who said yes? And she left and she never came back. Now that's community building. The wisdom is in the neighbourhood. Yes, there are limits to local. Yes, there are things that need to be brought in from outside. Of course there are. But if we don't tap the wisdom first, we're never going to know what needs to come in from outside. Not in any democratic way. It will always be top down, because there is no other way. People don't know what they don't know. But by the same token, people don't know what they need until they first know what they have. And actually the best way for people to discover what they have is by sharing stories of a time that they've come together to make a difference. So what I'd like to do now is to listen to my own story, in a sense, listen to my own advice, and invite your voice into the room. Because my sense of it is that it's your stories that form the foundation of the future of Trafford. It's your stories, particularly about a time when you come together in your neighbourhood with your neighbours to make a difference. So we're going to go into World Cafe, and I think, let me get the slides up here. Don't forget to tweet if that's your bag. And breathe. There we go. We're going to go into World Cafe. Just one of the things that somebody asked me during the lunch break is, what does this mean from a policy perspective? What would look different if we radically introduce this? I think this is a reasonable summary of what would look different. A lot of our present policies are focused very much on deficits and responding to problems. It's very much about fixing people, finding problems, fixing people. And I suppose in a sense the working assumption is that programs are the answers, are the answer, and that experts have the solutions. If we radically introduced this way of working, in other words, if we had a way of embedding this in the culture of organizations and the culture of neighborhoods. What we would see is an endemic focus on people's strengths and capacities. And not just people. As I said, there were 5 assets. So also the ecology, the actual place. Place is the stage on which all of this plays out. And that's why I think scale really matters here. The best way to embed this is, as I've said already, to organize the way people organize their lives. Typically as human beings, we can only really have intimate, asset-based relationships with about 140 people. We start to really struggle after that. That's why working at neighbourhood scale, and what I mean by neighbourhood scale should not be confused with ward scale or locality. They are different terms, they're different scales. What I'm talking about is a scale of about 3,000 people. So a lot of what I'll be saying later on in the afternoon is that at that scale, that's where you can build relationships with people based on their capacities. And more importantly, they can build relationships with each other that sustain and endure. But if you do that, if you make that investment, what would ultimately happen is we would shift from a belief that programs are the answer to a belief that people are the answer. And in effect, we would shift from thinking about people as clients of our services to thinking about people as citizens of their communities and democracy. And that's really important. The word client comes from a Greek derivative which means to be on one's back and powerless. Citizen is a co-creator of a compelling future. We get to choose. You know, the great thing about a democracy is you get to choose. But if you've got nothing but systems and services in your life creating dependency, that choice gets decreased. So we're talking about big stuff. We're not just talking about the neighbourhood. And you know, it's important that we emphasize neighbourhood, but we're also talking about changing democracy. This is very, very radical roots. And that's one of the things that worries me about what people are calling an asset-based approach or a strength-based approach. Because essentially the asset-based approach and the strength-based approach says, oh look, everybody is good, everybody has gifts and talents, just see the positive in everybody. Asset-based community development doesn't just focus on individuals, it's focusing on associations, and ultimately its ambition is to create an association of associations in every neighbourhood that has the power to plan, the power to define the next 10, 20 years, and the power to care. And for me, if you look at the foundations of democracy, there are 2 things at the heart of democracy. First is the freedom of expression, and second is the freedom of association. So this is about strengthening our democracy, not just about building nice neighbourhoods. And my understanding is there's a lot of people from local council in the room today. And if I were you, I'd be thinking, what's this calling me to? Is it just calling me to do some nice neighbourhood work, to find some third sector organisations that I can commission to go and do this? No, it's not just calling you to do that, though it is calling you to do that. It's also calling you as stewards of democracy to figure out a way of reorganising local government so the power is in the hands of people. And that's a powerful, compelling, and also very scary call to action, particularly for a lot of local governments who have become much more focused on the provision of services than on stewarding and democracy. But actually we've got to do both. So that's what it would look like. And I suppose one of the things that I would say to people is, Upton Sinclair, a very famous journalist and iconoclast, once said that a person would never understand that which their salary depends on them not understanding. So some people might be saying, is he saying that my job doesn't matter, that my contribution as a professional doesn't matter? And no, he isn't saying that at all. What I'm saying is that citizens' contribution matters equally, and maybe even a little bit more. That actually our job is to ensure that people step into their own individual and collective power. And I think one of the things that's really exciting for me when I look at the work that we're doing across the UK, which isn't just about standing up here talking, we're actually in neighbourhoods doing this work. So if you want to go and visit the work that we're doing, you can. It's all over the UK. And it's here, locally as well. And we have some stands that are talking about the local work. So, you know, it's important to recognise that. Seeing is believing. Actually, one of the things I'm absolutely convinced by in going into neighbourhoods is you can't think your way into this new action. You've got to act your way into this new thinking. So if you're thinking to yourself, what's next? Think about action. Think about what it is you can do, even if it's just in your own neighbourhood. But if you think about it from a policy perspective, and you're nervous now because you're thinking, this is a new world order and it's going to diss everything that's gone before, I want to give you a reassurance that in fact it's not. We'll still have statutory services. There'll still be things that are absolutely required. We still need the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff and the fence at the edge. But as well as the fence and the ambulance, we need to do something well in from the edge, and that, I think, is called community building. So I love this quote by Einstein where he says, new frameworks are like climbing a mountain. The larger view encompasses rather than rejects the earlier, more restricted view. So hopefully you find that reassuring. What I'd like to do now is invite you at your tables into a process of World Cafe. And the way World Cafe works is essentially we stay with a topic, a question for a period of time, probably about 20 minutes. And then, at the end of 20 minutes, I'll be back to you, raising my hand and interrupting your conversation. And I will invite each table to spread to the four winds, to go within this room, obviously, to go to other tables. But I will ask one ambassador, the table ambassador, to stay behind, and they're the holder of the conversation that has gone before. I'll cue you in on all of this, I'll take you through. But it's a really interesting process because what it challenges sometimes is the fact, I think we spend a lot of time talking to the same people about the same things. And I think we hear the sound of our own voice coming back at us a lot of the time. I call it the hollow resonance syndrome. What we're trying to do here is create disruptive innovation. And one of the simplest ways to do that is just talk to different people. So I'll take you through the process. But for now, what we'd like to do, let me just jump ahead here. The slide that I changed hasn't changed. Okay, sorry about that. What I'd like to do is I'd like to invite you at each of your tables. And if we've got tables with just 2 or 3 people, I'm going to ask you folks to populate another table that has some space for you. But I'd like you to think about, don't worry, there's too much information on that slide, don't worry about that, just listen to me. What I'd like you to think about is a time in your neighbourhood. So take off your professional hat here for a second, if you have one. A time in your neighbourhood when you and your neighbours came together to make things better, without any outside professional help. So it might be that you need to go back to your childhood to think about that. That's fine. It might even be that you can't think of any examples, and that will be interesting. But actually for most people, if you search your memory banks, you'll find there's lots of examples. So what I'd like you to do, at your table, they're relatively large tables, but I'd like you to just begin to tell each other some stories, regale each other with some stories that you know of. If you can't think of any of your own personal community, I'll give you a cheat card. You are allowed to tell stories about other communities that have inspired you. We're going to take about 20 minutes, and let's see what stories surface when it comes to citizen-led action in Trafford. Enjoy.
Some of you may be aware of the story. My name is Laura Burgess. I'm the Trafford Area Inspector for Aldringham and Sale. Quite a sad story. On December the 22nd last year, just before Christmas, you're making me cry now. An address in Timperley was broken into. Mum and Dad had the car stolen. They had keys, wallets, credit cards, you name it. The thing little so-and-sos took it all. One of the things that they also took was all the Christmas presents under the Christmas tree for the 13-year-old daughter. We put it on social media, and I can only sort of suffice to say we were absolutely inundated from the public, local community. They came down and they donated presents for the 13-year-old girl. We took 4 van loads of toys to that address. We didn't expect that, and then even in the days afterwards we were still getting presents, we were still getting tickets for the local theatre, we were getting presents from Argos, from other catalogue companies, Boots, and in the end the family were actually saying, you know, actually we're quite embarrassed about this. We can't take any more, but thank you so much. Please donate this to anywhere else. So we ended up giving presents and tickets for cinemas, etc. To some local children's homes. So that's just an example of the community. Unfortunately, sometimes it's when crisis happens and awful events like that, but that girl had an amazing Christmas.
Yes. Because when we hear stories from people who are just like us, and yet they're doing things, or they're telling us they've done things that seem insurmountable to us from our particular perch in the tree, I think it motivates us. It mobilizes us to try something that maybe we may not have thought possible. What I'd like to do now is I'd like to invite you to, again, notwithstanding we have an ambassador at each table, so they stay. But everybody else, if you could spread to different tables, and I mean literally spread to different tables. So, and when you're there, I'm going to give you another question, which will try to deepen this exercise. So don't all from one table go to another table. Spread throughout all the tables. Get a good mix. We won't have that by feedback. Okay, so who would like to start us off? What we're looking for is nuggets of wisdom around next steps, essentially. What we can do to get more of these stories. Yep. Actually, I believe we have 2 mics, so if you manage this section, I'll manage this section. Okay?
Our table is quite privileged, really. There's a lot of community activists and volunteers on here, and are involved with groups that have developed quite substantially over a period of time. And what we ended up talking about was the value that these community groups bring to our community, and the fact that as time has gone on, they're perceived as being part of the furniture, and it's almost as if they're there and they're going to always be there. And I think as a local authority, you need to reassess your approach to voluntary community groups that serve the community, and look again at the value that they bring, and not take them for granted, because most are sustaining themselves, but they will come to a point where they will need help. And for the sake of, I don't know, for the sake of a small amount of money invested in them at times of need, you may lose a massive community resource that's really sown and invested directly into the people who live on the streets that you're actually serving. So look again at the voluntary and community sector with different eyes and really assess the value that it brings. I would suggest for every pound that the statutory service spends or invests in these, you probably get £5–10 back. So look again.
Look again. Great. And looking really deeply, isn't it? Because it's seeing the groups that exist behind the formal groups as well, seeing the associations too, and valuing them as well. That's fantastic. It's a great start, a great call to action. What else? Yeah. Oh. If you could say who you are, that'd be great as well.
My name's Andy Roberts, and I'm a community ambassador for Sale. We thought that when people are having meetings together with the voluntary community groups, or anybody, they should allow about 20 minutes, half an hour at a time in the meeting to discuss these things with people, to get a feeling about what's going on in an area. I serve on a health and wellbeing group in Sale more often than not I'm being talked to. I'm not being asked about things, and I think that we think that that's a mistake. We think that we should talk to people in our communities, and we should learn from that. We also have a little bit of a caveat that not build up expectations. You know, be honest with people. Tell people, yeah, that's feasible, or it isn't feasible. Not we'll come back and let you know, type of things. But we just think that people should spend a little bit more time talking with us and what they do, and understanding that we're not a hindrance, that we're not being awkward. We want to work with you.
That's great, Andy. Thank you, and thanks to the group. So really listening, giving time, and being genuinely attentive to what's happening in the community. Thank you. And again, look again. There's lots out there. Value it, confirm it.
I think on this table, I have to excuse my voice, we talked about celebration and recognition. And even the 3 stories at the front, all in turn on our table, how do we get those to be known? There's a variety of partners, the council. Isn't there a way of pulling together to actually make sure that these things that are happening in the community feed through and an annual celebration where it's recognised? Hand in hand with that, you would hope that you would start to take a cultural change, both in terms of perhaps the way we do things, but also helping our community to understand that we want to do things differently.
Excellent, yeah. The power of stories, and we've been talking about it all day, is just immense. And it's really interesting because in a sense what I think I'm hearing across the three tables is there's lots of different ways of listening and hearing and valuing people, not overwhelming them or talking over them. Some of that is about intentionally ritualizing the storytelling, having annual events or quarterly events. Some of it's just about the humanity of actually being in conversation with people where that person knows they're being valued, they're being listened to, and the stories they have to share matter because space is being created intentionally for them. They're not big asks, they're powerful calls to action, but they're very achievable. What else would folk like to add? Yeah.
I'm Brian Whittaker, I'm one of the neighbourhood officers looking at the, what do we call ourselves now? The Ernston Partnership, Ernston and Parsons Partnership, the UPP. We had a look at a few different aspects, and I think one of them was that we came up with was red tape and all it encompasses. The local community wanted to put together an event in a park just to do a fun day or whatever. The amount of red tape around it is just enough to put anybody off, with risk assessments and this, that and the two others, and stewarding and insurance, and why would you bother? Why would you bother?
So in terms of doing something about that, had you any thoughts around what would, aside from the obvious one, which is get rid of the red tape, any practical suggestions from the group around how to move that forward?
Well, no, there was, when they did the street parties, the Jubilee and such like, people could apply, but they weren't being charged for road closures, the insurance. The council were going to cover the insurance, etc. So there's things like that that can be put in place. So it might not be for every event.
No, but some practical, that's a very practical step that could be taken. It's an example of the steps that could be taken. That's great, Brian. Thank you. Thanks to the group. What else? So we've heard a lot of things about just relationship, ritualizing the storytelling, getting the red tape and the barriers out of the way, examples of where it has been done, replicating those. I'll come to you and then over to you if that's okay. There we go. And if you remember to just say who you are.
Okay, my name is Danielle Garcia from the Imperial War Museum. We talked about how there's lots of really great community projects and groups around, but they're mostly hidden. No one really knows about each other. And they'd like support from each other. So we thought maybe about a community connector, someone that's employed to go into the local community whose job is to just find out about these groups and to build up a knowledge bank of these groups and start connecting each other.
Fantastic. Thank you. That's great. In a little while I'm going to share 7 things that I've observed as I travel around the world, and one of them is the importance of connectors. So it's fantastic to hear it coming out organically. It makes such sense, really, doesn't it? One of the things that, just if I may, one of the things that popped up in my head as you were talking about war museums is I was on the Bath Road a number of months ago. We're working in Gloucestershire, and I brought a number of people on a walk, a community walk. It's one of the things we do. And just off the Bath Road, there's a road called Suffolk Street. And on that street, there's a militaria shop. And in the militaria shop, there's a chap by the name of Steve, who runs the shop. As you can imagine, a militaria shop, which sells old military regalia, doesn't get much passing trade. There's not too many people walking by saying, I know what I need today, a spear. So, most of their trade is online. So he's got this huge, floor space that nobody uses. And we discovered that every Friday morning, quite impromptu, what he calls 10 older boys, servicemen, ex-servicemen, come and have a coffee morning there. And it really struck me because the next day I was with Cheltenham Borough Homes and Cheltenham Borough Council, and my opening question was, who knows Steve on Suffolk Street? If you don't know Steve, he'll provide a service. So that's powerful. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm a local councillor in Sale. On our table we came up with some ideas. We think it's really important to smile, and we really think it's important when walking down the street to say good morning. We think our PCSOs are particularly good at this, they're really welcoming. That's when they haven't come into my garden to tell me off for not shutting my gate. The other things we think are really positive is that we have a lot of friends groups in Trafford, and this started with just one group of people that were upset about the state of their park. But they took on the park, working with the council, and really improved that park. That spread right across the borough, so we have lots of friends group now working in parks. But it's not just improving the parks, it's the social activities, it's the events, it's bringing people in, and everybody's got a park. Wherever they live, you've got a park, so you can get involved with other people. And I think he was saying very strongly that we need to share the positive news, as has already been said, of what's happening. Because you said the national papers are all bad news, but the local papers tend to give a lot more, didn't you? A lot more good news. So we felt that was really important to get the positive news out of the papers.
Absolutely. And it's positive news about areas, but also positive news about people who tend to really be stigmatised. Young people is a case in point. I'm really struck, as I come in and out of the UK in particular, at how media pathologises young people. It's just horrendous. And it's quite remarkable. I mean, by comparison with other countries that I'm in, the media here really has an issue with young people. And I think it needs to get over itself. And I wonder whether one of the issues is that we use terms like youth at risk. I don't think youth are at risk. I think youth are at promise. They're at risk when we don't recognise their promise. But we use clumsy labels like that because we think it would make it easier for us to reach them. I think we really need to think about those kinds of words, because in a way, if we don't do it, the likelihood is the media certainly won't. So there's something about role modelling there, but yeah, absolutely, taking care of our reputation. I grew up in a city in Limerick where we were known as Stab City. People were stabbed, but not nearly as much as the media would report. I think it goes back to the point you were making earlier on about being intentional about the stories you put out there. But also having conversations with the media. Media can be held to account as well, and they should be, particularly when they talk about our communities. So in Chicago, we've seen really interesting stuff happen, and it's happening now in Gloucestershire as well, where local communities have sat down with media, national and local, and said, we need to sign a memorandum of understanding. If you want to cover our community, here's a way of doing it. And it works, it's really powerful, so thank you.
Corinne from Trafford Council. We were talking, sort of links a couple of points, about taking more risks in how we do things and giving trust to the community.
Brilliant, brilliant. It's a really important point. We can't do this work unless we're prepared to take risks. It's the only way. And the central question here is, what risks are we prepared to take together? This is about risk taking. There's no question. Anybody like to add to what we've heard? Because I think there's going to be a lot of common ground. But anything that we haven't heard that you'd feel is important to add? There we go.
Hello, I'm Jane Brophy, I'm a councillor in South Trafford. We've got two councillors on our table here. And one of the themes we both came up with, both from different parties, but we still came up with the same themes, is sometimes things work best in communities when the councillors step back. And the colleague on the original table that was at also reminded me of a story in my ward where my colleague got some people together from the community to create a friends group. But he didn't really do anything. All he did was bring together the people who contacted him to get them talking to each other. And it was very similar to another example from the table from your group in Sale, wasn't it? But actually sometimes the best way of doing things is just to bring the right people together and then get out of the situation when you know you're not needed.
That's fantastic. So lead by stepping back while still caring. So let me see if I can summarise where we've gotten to so far, and then it'll be easier for you to see whether or not there's stuff to be added. I think one of the things that people are saying very clearly is that relationships matter more than power, position or privilege. Relationships have to be prioritised, and we've got to see them being prioritised. So meetings need to look different. I have a friend who says, why have a meeting when you can have a party? 85% of the population will not engage with you if the only way of engaging is having meetings. So if you want to engage with people, have a party. But have a party that's genuine, that's actually about hearing people into expression, hearing people into speech, hearing their stories and taking the time to do that. I think the other thing that seems to be coming across quite clearly is place matters. We've focused hugely in Europe on target groups. And I'm really struck by this because I think what we've done inadvertently is we've gone into neighbourhoods and we've segmented people into target groups, youth at risk, frail, elderly and so on. And I think we did it with the best will in the world. We really intended good. But, you know, in the same way that in the medical profession there is such thing as doctor-created illness, known as iatrogenesis, I think that goes on in every single profession I've ever encountered. The unintended consequence where we create the opposite of what we intend, where prisons become academies of crime, where education facilities become the generation of stupefaction. So, in a sense, I think what people are saying is that place matters, actually, because that's where everything comes together. That's where we can really connect with people and people can connect with each other. So there's that drive, from what I'm hearing anyway, to get as close to people's doorsteps as possible. So that seems a second theme that's emerging. I think another one is about focusing on strengths, or what we would call assets. Focusing on the fact that people have something of value, everybody has something of value to offer. So being asset-based, relationship-based, place-based, and also citizen-led. We heard just from Jane, we heard from Jane, you know, actually power grows when you give it away, right? When you step back, when you figure out how to lead in a way that's actually about inviting people into relationships, taking their own course, rather than trying to get people to follow you. And that's a really powerful challenge, because so often what I think we're doing is growing client base instead of growing interdependency and community. And actually, that's a massive challenge for everybody, and for the commissioners in the room as well. Because an awful lot of commissioning rewards second-tier organisations that grow client base, instead of saying, we want you to grow community, and actually we'll measure your impact by the number of, I guess, citizens in connection with each other, not clients on your books. So they're really powerful challenges. It strikes me that another thing that's implicit in what you're saying is that social justice matters. That there are people who are on the margins, that there are people who are excluded, and if we're not intentional about including them, they will get excluded every time. So I've heard a number of people ask, you know, that question through different conversations. How do we ensure people who are marginalised come to the centre? I think it's a really important question. But is there anything else you'd like to add before we move on?
Thanks, Thomas. For people who don't know me, my name is Ralph Gooden. I come from the community sector. I'm a settlement partnership executive. I think the first 2 points we've brought up, to paraphrase, we have a number of sectors separated by a common language. We need to make sure that we understand what we're saying to each other. And to answer the question, which will help we make sure that we focus and develop more community-led stories. Let the storyteller tell their own stories. Don't presume that you can speak for them. I mean, the person we had up there, she was so passionate about what she delivered. No one else could recreate that passion. So don't think that you can presume to tell the story in the same way. The first point of call should be the person that's delivered the success of the group. Let them try to tell their own stories.
That's fantastic. That's great advice. Thank you. Okay. So we're coming near the end, and I think there's 2 things that would be worth thinking about before we go. The first is, just if I could, in very brief, share some of the stories that are emerging from different parts of the world where I'm working. And maybe not even the stories, because I'm not sure we have time, but some of the essential ingredients that I think I'm seeing when it comes to building powerful communities. where the storyteller is the community. And then I think what we need to think about is what are the next steps and who's going to pledge to do what. We can talk theoretically about next steps, and I guess if we had more time that would be interesting to do. But I guess what I'm curious about is who's going to work on what. Because we have a little bit of an agenda here, it strikes me, for the next number of partnership meetings, you know, and maybe some core principles that the partnership could work to if they're not already, or could really embellish and deepen if they are. But I'm curious about, you know, where the energy in the room is. So I'd like to just very quickly share some of the key elements that I think I'm observing, but use the lion's share of the time that's left to hear from people who are really, really passionate about action. I'm going to hand the microphone in about 10 minutes or so over to you. And if you've got fire in your belly and you want to work on something, the microphone is yours, and you share it as a call to action. The risk is that nobody comes around you, but typically community being community, actually you'll find that you're standing on common ground, and that there are people who will take risks with you. They may not necessarily stand up and identify themselves here, but my experience, and I've done this a lot for a lot of years, is that when people stand up and they pin their flag to the mast in terms of what it is they're prepared to do, people come behind them, or come beside them, more to the point. So I'll do that in a few moments by way of finishing call to action. But I just wanted to very quickly share what I think are 7 core things that seem to be recurring in all of the learning sites around asset-based community development that I'm aware of. And I'm aware there's a lot that I'm not aware of, but certainly based on my own learning. The first thing, and these are very brief because you have the detail in your handout in your pack, so they're just different guide sheets that I'm sharing with you to talk about our work in the different learning sites. I hope everybody has, they should be in this pack here, so you'll find if you chug in, they look like this, okay? So these are just guide sheets that if you're interested in the engineering question of how do I do this on Monday morning, then they're there. And I would strongly encourage you to just give it a, give it a shot. If something's worth doing, it's worth doing badly. So give it a shot. But the 7 things. The first, I think, is the importance of a community builder in every neighborhood. Really thinking about this, I'm absolutely convinced of the economics of this. So instead of tangerinizing communities where we've got lots of people who are working with target groups, thinking about the prospect of working with the juice rather than the segments, of actually what would happen if we had a competent person, paid, who is answerable to the community, right? Who's just connecting people. Like literally, that would be their job spec. 2 words, just connect. And what would that be like? Well, all of the evidence is telling me it would be transformational. And, again, I would suggest that if we had more time, we could get into the stories. But they're there. Go visit Croydon. Go visit some of the local communities here in Oldham and Trafford. And different, there are people in the room who are working. We've got stands. So go and see this stuff. Hear the stories. They're inspiring. But that's the starting point. Having a community builder who knows what they're doing. Because it would probably, I would say, be reasonable to say that you can't just take the words community development and say community development is community development. What I'm describing here, I think, involves community development, but it's different as well. It's more subtle. It's more about street level walking. I used to call it street walking, and then I realized it has different connotations here than it does in Ireland. But it's about getting on the street, and it's about brokering relationships, and it's not everybody's bag. Not everybody does it terribly well. You know that because you do it every day of the week. But those that do it well have that ability to do it in a way that doesn't get in the way. So they have the capacity to bring people together without needing people to follow them or needing people to elevate them. That's the first. I think the second one is no matter how good a community builder is, they are never going to be sufficient. For 2 reasons. One is most community builders, though not all, will be from outside of the community or paid. So even if they're in the community, the fact that they're paid separates them a little bit, and that's okay. But the second principle I would share with you mitigates that. And the second principle is finding connectors. These are local, unpaid people. They're not volunteers. In fact, most connectors have a real issue with the word volunteer. And when we ask them why they have an issue with it, they say because in their experience, there's so much red tape around volunteering these days. What they really want to do is they want to do stuff that they care about themselves, that they're passionate about. So finding connectors who are really good at building relationships with their neighbours. In every neighbourhood there are connectors. For every population of 3,000 people, there are at least 100 connectors. These are people who have relationships with between 50 to 80 of their neighbours. They don't even realise they have those relationships, but they do. And they naturally and fluently connect these people together. Recently, I was talking at a conference which was all around how you measure this stuff, and somebody was talking about the importance of ensuring if 100 people come to the meeting, that you capture the fact that 100 people come to the meeting. I said, no, that's not the point. What you should be capturing is the fact that 100 people have the potential to form 9,450 connections. What you should be measuring is how many of those connections actually were formed. Otherwise, people just came to a meeting. And we all know, meetings go one of two ways. They either lead to action or they don't. So it's really critical that we find the connectors. And I think one of the reasons that we've struggled to find connectors is because we've been so focused on finding leaders. We need connectorship, not just leadership. And I think we're looking for a different kind of leadership. A leadership that is about the capacity to host conversations, to include people's voices. A leader with emotional intelligence that can actually help people get related and connected, not somebody who just can spin a good yarn and inspire people. The process of inspiration is important, but at the end of the day, it's just a process of say and spray, or say and pray. What really makes change happen is local people who get people in relationships and value them. And I think that's what we need to invest. So a community builder's job is effectively to find those connectors. The third thing I can share is the importance of finding associations, and the hidden ones particularly. The more informal, the more important. The likes of Steve and his coffee morning, the poker clubs, the reading groups, the knit and natter groups, or certainly in Dublin what we call the stitch and bitch groups, or whatever they're called. Groups that come together informally by consent, not by control, or not because they're following money. This is really important. They're driven by passion, not just a grant. And it's not that at some point or another they may not apply for a grant. Of course they probably will. But it's about where the intrinsic motivation is coming from. And I think my experience has been that there are two kinds of communities. There are grant-dependent communities, and there are asset-dependent communities. And the grant-dependent communities are interesting because they start with a grant of yay size, which they spend down, and so they have nothing left, except the capacity to apply for another grant, based on a map of misery that says, look, we were this miserable before you gave us the grant, now we're this miserable, so give us a bigger one. And then there's an asset-based community that actually inverts that triangle. And starts with a very little bit of resource, maybe 2 or 3 mums who really want to make a difference because they know that their 14-year-olds are going down the wrong road, and they come together and they talk about what they've got, and they take the point that their community is a place that doesn't have a rich reputation because so many people say bad things about it. They say nobody works around here and so on and so forth. And they say, hang on, actually, maybe that's what we need to do. Maybe what we need to do is encourage all of our kids to go to work with people who do work here, to spend the day over the summer with each of the people who do work. Imagine if every person who was involved in some kind of a sustainable living, a sustainable livelihood, said to young people, if you're interested, join me for a day where I work. Now, I think that would create a very different youth engagement strategy. Not one that actually takes all the youth at risk and puts them together with all the other youth at risk, but one that says to young people, you have potential, and I'd really like to share where I've gone with mine as a productive adult. Yeah, it does take a village to raise a child, but it also takes a child to raise a village. So what you might find is that those 3 or 4 mums and the 3 or 4 girls that they're worrying about will actually create a different conversation because of their starting point. And that, like we've heard the stories, that percolates out. None of this stuff goes to scale. You can't scale this up. Somebody asked me recently, can we bring this to industrial scale? I love it. I said, no, you can't. This beds and it spreads. It goes deep and it goes out, but it doesn't go to scale. That's the language of the institution. That's Aer Lingus, right? But that's not what we're talking about. So I think that piece around finding the associations is really important, and the more informal, the better. And actually creating what I would call an association of associations. Not a residence association, but an actual association of associations. This is a reckless act of community building. This idea that you could take 160 different groups and put them in a room like this, and we could have a conversation that leads to change. We did it today. We're doing it right now. It can be done. We can include everyone. So I think that's the next stage, is finding the associations and helping them connect, because that's what grows power. Power grows when you start with the assets of people individually. You connect them in association with small groups. Those small groups connect with other small groups, and the association of association, the small group of small groups, comes together and says, let's create a vision. One of the things that's really important, and it's the fourth thing that I think I can share, is people's ideas need to be linked together. It's really, really important to recognize that as we talk with people and find out what they care about, whether they're in clubs and groups or individually, that what people are yearning for is connectivity. So often people think that they're the only person with the idea, or they're the only person with the concern, and they're afraid to take action. But when they discover that 3 or 4 other people have exactly the same challenge and are prepared to contribute some of their gifts, that's when change happens. So sharing ideas really matters, and being intentional about bringing people into conversation. It's not about mapping misery, but it's about creating ideas of new possibility. Very briefly, the other things that I'd share is we've touched, I think, around the edges of money, and maybe money being a problem sometimes. But there are times when people come up with ideas where having some resource matters. I think one of the difficulties is not money per se, but it's the scale and it's the complexity within which we have to engage with money. So I would commend to you the approach that Seattle local government took in this regard. And we're seeing different examples of this being replicated across the UK now. What they call small sparks or matching funds, where they basically said to people, we're leaving behind the charity model that said, you know, we'll set the agenda based on our evidence, and then we'll tell you what to apply to us. And they said, no, that's the wrong way around. We shouldn't be setting the agenda. We shouldn't be setting the outcomes. You as a community should. So why don't you find out what it is you care about enough to actually do something around, and then let us know how we can be helpful. Over the last 20-odd years, they've invested $50 million in very, very small amounts of money. And as a consequence, over $77 million worth of what the Americans call sweat equity, we might call voluntary labor or something of that kind, but actual civic power and civic muscle has been flexed. And it's hugely inspirational, because no matter where you go in Seattle now, you'll find the handprints, the fingerprints of citizens on civic space. And that's the measure. I think you can really measure the sustainability of something by the number of citizen fingerprints that are on it. So often I come across these wonderful things that people have created that nobody wanted. And then, you know, we're having conversations about why nobody engages, why nobody really cares about this. They never did. Not just because they weren't engaged in conversation and consultation, but because they weren't engaged in action and an actual creation. So I think that's a really important point. The final point I'll make is that I think it really matters to think not just about the immediate project or even getting communities involved in having conversations. I think it really matters to think 10 years out. Because while it's fantastic to grow community morale, and it's really important to grow community projects, if people aren't encouraged to think, well, what's life going to be like in 10 or 20 years from here? One of the things that we might actually achieve is gentrification. So we go in, we mobilize all of these communities, right? All these communities that have been labeled as, you know, low income disadvantage. Community increases, their you know, the attractability of their houses increases, and suddenly their children can't afford to live there. We really need to think about this stuff. Because 10 years out, the world's going to look a dramatically different world to the world it now is. We are becoming more urbanized and older faster than any other time on the face of the planet. And with that comes all kinds of challenge and change. So the beauty of doing what I've described, which is community building, is eventually you get to the point where hundreds and sometimes thousands of people can sit in conversation with each other and create their own community vision that answers three fundamental questions. The first question is, what are we going to do around here over the next 10 years using community power? The second question is, what are we going to do using community power with the help of outside agencies? And what does that help need to look? And the final question, once we've answered those two, is what's left for the agencies to do? And there is stuff that's left for the agencies. But now we have citizens saying, we're doing our bit, we need you to do yours. Now that's my understanding of what democracy is all, where the citizen is at the centre, holding us as public servants to account, and is saying, this we do with the power of the people, through the power of the people, but this you need to do in service. And I think that's the full potential of the Localism Act. I think that's when you'll see real, legacy around social value. But that absolutely has to start at street level and work its way up. The prize at the end of that, though, is democracy, and it's worth fighting. Imagine a situation where you had a federation of neighbourhoods in Trafford, where every neighbourhood had a community builder, had 30 connectors, could identify what it is they cared about, build an association of associations, create a vision, and inform us as to how we might be of good service. That'd be pretty amazing, wouldn't it? That's within our grasp. It's totally doable. And actually, you've got the resources financially to do it right now. But what you can't do is continue doing all of the other stuff and do that. So, as well as commissioning community building, there may be some painful decisions around decommissioning some stuff that isn't building community, but is building client base. Thank you. We've come to the end of the process. I'm sorry we don't have more time to get these pledges, but what I would suggest is this. Before you go, each of you fill out one of these. Genuinely, if you're motivated to do so. This isn't, I'm not compelling or mandating anybody to do this. But if we could create, we use maybe working together with you, if you don't mind, as a posting. But anybody who feels really passionate and wants to pledge to actually take this conversation to the next stage, just write down what it is you want to do and your contact details. And I'll sort of throw the grenade behind me because somebody's going to have to pick that up. But I think it's really important, and Teresa said it before she went, I really want to make sure something comes of this. So this is a way, I guess, of putting your flag up in the sky and saying, here I am, and if you're interested, contact me. So if that makes sense to you, a little pledge posted before you go will at least leave your footprint in the sand.
Fantastic. It's a round of applause, please, for Cormac. Bless you, thank you. That was just informative and challenging and inspiring, and I think probably saying deep down actually what people believe, and but just articulating it for us. We're so thankful. I hope it leads to change, institutional change, but I suppose I hope it leads to just some change this week actually. I think there are some elderly neighbours who may need a visit, and there's perhaps other things, street parties coming up in the summer, I don't know. But we can do something. We don't have to wait for somebody else to do something. We can do something, and I love that. In fact, our table came up with a really good targeted response. It was if crises bring people together, then we should just focus crises, basically, sort of turn the water off on the streets and see what happened. Get some burglaries, targeted burglaries. It was just an idea. I love the asset-based approach, and I think it really ties in with our aspiration as a partnership, because this partnership, as I've said for the last few years, is our Trafford. This isn't their Trafford, this isn't your Trafford, this is our Trafford. And this borough operates best when we work together, when every citizen, as Cormac has said, is being enabled and inspired, our institutions are working together. We live in a world that's increasingly pulling apart, whether it's rich and poor or ethnic division or just less neighbourhood connectivity. but people actually underline living that way. And most people I talk to, certainly within civic authorities, are people who want to work with other people actually. And most community groups I meet with are people who want to connect with other community groups and get things going. So I think there's a lot of goodwill. I think we're taking some steps towards it. I think there are some great relationships in Trafford. I think there's a lot of goodwill. I think there's a lot of kindness actually in this borough. And I think we have a good partnership. I think we're hearing about some of the things now that could make us a great partnership. And it's moving from the good to the great, which is one of our challenges. So thank you so much for just spending time with us today. It's been absolutely brilliant. A big thank you to all those involved in putting the day together as well, for the Trafford Leisure Trust who told us how fit we are, to the Life Centre for this fantastic building. Welcome here for the partnership team who put so much time in, for Matthew and Sean, and for the locality chair team, for the exhibitors, and most of all for yourselves for just turning up. It's just so good to see so many people from so many different sectors in our borough. So thank you so much for coming, really appreciate it. We'd love to get your feedback, so the feedback forms are in your pack. Please don't leave without filling those in. And also your responses, as Cormac said, to that banner over there, the Elmston and Partington one. That'd be great. Put your feedback on there. And thank you so much for coming.